Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Welcome to Southwark. Not a very nice night to be out, and let's hope that you get home before this storm, whatever it's called, it's got a funny name, hits us. So we don't want to delay this evening before getting on to Viscount Montgomery's talk, but I just wanted to share with you that I first met Henry, as he was then at Agricultural College in Devon, about 49 years ago. At that time, of course, we were absorbed in learning the rudiments of ruminants, and Henry's lineage quite passed me by, as I think it did many of us at that college at Seal Hen at the time, because he was incredibly modest about it and so didn't really talk about it. But latterly, of course, more recently, Henry and I have crossed paths through the Southwark Revival, and we've been involved in the Southwark Revival for 10 years. And Henry and Susan Eisenhower were at Southwark House for the occasion of the 75th anniversary of D-Day, unveiling a stained glass window then. So I met up with Henry again there, which was a great pleasure. And so I had that connection, and I was delighted when Henry accepted the invitation to attend the Southwark Revival event this year. Having gained Henry's agreement to come, then Henry very kindly introduced me to Susan Eisenhower. So she was the next on the list. He said, well, Henry's coming, of course. I'll be delighted. And then we managed to track down Richard Tedder and Will Ramsey. So we had the descendants of the 4 supreme commanders of D-Day who were just up the road there, planning D-Day 80 years ago in June, and they were all here in June and presented a wonderful Q&A session for us in the afternoon. So we were honoured that you were able to join us then, Henry, and thank you for your assistance in gathering up the other descendants. And we're equally delighted that you've agreed to come and talk to us this evening about your grandfather. You're not actually the first of Montgomery's family to visit this hall, although it was only built in 1996, because it was actually Henry's father, who was then the second Viscount, David Montgomery, who opened this hall in 1996, which was built from proceeds of a fundraising summer for the 70th anniversary, the 50th anniversary of D-Day. We get mixed up with these different 50 and 70 and so quite an association here with the Montgomery family that I hope will continue for many years to come. So without further ado, I'd like you to give Henry Montgomery, Viscount Montgomery, a really big solid revival. Okay, have those.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you everyone for coming this evening and for inviting me to talk. I'm sort of mildly daunted, really, because I suspect your knowledge of military history is rather greater than mine. I'm not a historian at all. As Martin said, I've really been involved in agriculture all my life. And so I've come to this sort of rather late in life. But I am interested in leadership and in what, using grandfather's terminology, what makes people tick. Given the history of this village, I suppose I should be really talking about grandfather's role in the Normandy campaign, but I'm afraid I'm not going to do that. I want to really talk about grandfather's life and his leadership style and how that evolved. And in particular, really, how he was able to, or what led up to him being able to transform a completely dispirited and ultimately, to that point, retreating army in August 1942 into an effective fighting force that never really looked back. So I'm going to split the talk this evening into 3 sections, and I'll have sort of questions in between so that you have a chance to stop listening to me for a while. The first 2 sections I'm going to look at grandfather's life, and then the last section I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Spirit of Normandy Trust, which is an organisation that I'm involved in that takes veterans over to Normandy for D-Day commemorations each year. As Monty's only grandson, I'm obviously thoroughly biased, so you have to take that into account and perhaps weigh up whether you think what I'm saying is valid. I know that with the benefit of hindsight, grandfather's style and strategic sort of decision-making has attracted much criticism. Very little of that criticism has actually come from people who served with him. Some of the criticism may indeed be valid, but I think it probably detracts a little bit from what he actually achieved. I'm also pretty biased because during my annual pilgrimages to Normandy each year, I've heard firsthand from veterans their harrowing experiences of the war, but also their thoughts about grandfather. They loved him to a man, without exception. I remember being on a bus in 2017 with a group of veterans when it was announced from the front of the bus that I was going to be joining them for the whole of the pilgrimage in 2018, the following year, and one of the old veterans at the back, who had quite a humour, said, I suppose if I survived the war being pushed about by Monty, I can survive next year being pushed about by his grandson. So grandfather would have liked that humour, and indeed he did have a great sense of humour, and my sister and I had both had very happy memories of spending time with him. He was generous, told funny stories, had a great big smile, and gave us a lot of freedom to explore his space, his garden, and particularly, curators would be horrified, his wartime caravans, which he kept in his garden, and one of them was a sort of caravan that had a huge map of Europe on it, and it had sort of things on it that were obviously very important, and we used to move them around. But he seemed to us to be a man at peace who enjoyed his retirement. But back to the task in hand. Who was Monty? Born in 1887, he was the 4th of what was to become a family of 9 children, 7 of whom survived. His father was an Anglican vicar, son of a distinguished civil servant, and his mother, the daughter of a well-known Victorian preacher. They were married in 1881. He was 34, she was 16. They'd actually been engaged for 2 years, believe it or not, since she was 14. By the age of 22, she had 4 children. In 1889, when Monty was 2, he was appointed the Bishop of Tasmania. And that's where they lived for the next 12 years as a family. Tasmania was a pretty wild place in those days. He was a very wild boy. And his father travelled widely across what was a huge diocese, including many of the sort of Pacific islands. So he was away from home for months at a time. And the mother, whose family was growing, ruled the family with a rod of iron. And grandfather tells of a story of how, after some misdemeanour, his father took him into the family chapel and prayed with him, presumably for forgiveness, but also that he would become a better boy. And they came out of the chapel, and his mother was waiting with a whip to beat him. So they returned to England in 1901. Monty was sent to St Paul's School in London, which they lived in London at the time. He was a very keen sportsman. Bearing in mind, he'd never actually really been to school at that point, so age sort of 13, he was 13 or 14, I suppose. He was sort of pretty unruly and pretty unschooled. but he captained both the cricket and actually football teams, and he was nicknamed the Monkey, and he was in the school magazine. He was described as like this, and this is slightly paraphrased, but the monkey is vivacious and has unflagging energy. It is much feared by neighbouring animals due to its tendency to pull the hair out of their heads. This it calls tackling. It shows no mercy, stamping on their heads and doing many other atrocities with a view to showing its patriotism. He was not very academic either, but he pulled his socks up sufficiently to qualify for Sandhurst. He loved his time there. He excelled at games, just about managed the academic side. But there was still a wild streak in him, and at times a bit of a cruel streak. There was one occasion when he and a group of cadets decided to give somebody they didn't like too much a bit of a fright, and it turned out really quite badly. They pinned this poor chap down with bayonets on a table and set fire to his shirt tails, and he was actually really badly burnt, and he was demoted. His mother came to the rescue and persuaded the head of, the commandant at Sandhurst, whatever that person is called, to keep him there for a bit longer. And he actually did then decide to buckle down and do some work, and was commissioned, but 6 months later than he should have been. So, but he learnt his lesson actually, and one of the things that sort of shocked him really was how the staff were very detached from the cadets, and it sort of shocked him that they didn't have better control of what was going on, and that sort of concern about absent leadership sort of slightly began to take root in him at that stage, and that was sort of the beginnings of his sort of understanding about, or his concerns about how leadership worked in the army at the time, and in the First World War, that really sort of took root in him and was fully reinforced. So after that, he joined the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. He was posted to India, and he started to take his career seriously, and as he put it, master his profession. He was obsessed by military history, and was determined to learn from the mistakes of the past. He was the person that everybody in the officers' mess wanted to avoid sitting next door to, because he was fantastically boring. He had very little small talk, and all he wanted to talk about was his military theories. And by the start of World War I, he was back in England. He was a full lieutenant, and he'd actually passed out top in the Army signalling exams, which was amazing. So he was definitely beginning to take his career seriously. At the beginning of the war, he was posted to France, and within 3 months he was shot and really quite badly injured. He was shot through one lung, which he lost, and also through the knee. He was only saved by the fact that the person who came to tend to his injuries was shot and fell on top of him and took the rest of the bullets. That poor chap died. But he was sent back, eventually recovered. He was sent back in 1916 and saw out the rest of the war. But the war left an indelible mark on him. He later wrote that the only impressive result of the war, as far as he was concerned, was the number of casualties, and they horrified him. He was equally horrified by the approach of the leaders. It seemed normal for orders to be given that attacks were to be delivered regardless of loss. And he was horrified also by the lack of contact between the generals and the people in the front line. And he felt that what the inverted commas good generals were ones who seemed to have no regard for human life. and he was determined to ensure that things were done differently. And in that crusade, to ensure that the army did do things differently, he made himself deeply unpopular. He was described as meddlesome, narrow-minded, and insufferably sure of himself. And as a result, he was often overlooked for promotion. But despite that, those early years were marked by steady progression. He attended Staff College, where he was described as a bloody menace because of his insistence on the need for radical change. In 1926, he became a teacher at Staff College for 3 years and later wrote a groundbreaking manual on infantry training, which I'm led to believe has been very influential, and it was, I think, stood the test of time for a very long time. That period was also marked by personal tragedy. He married late in life, in 1927, to a widow who had 2 children, and whose husband had been killed at Gallipoli, so the children were sort of teenagers. And they had 10 happy years together, but in I think it was 1936, they were on holiday in Burnham-on-Sea, and she was bitten by an insect, got septicemia, and died. So, this sort of this very loving relationship came to an end, and he was absolutely inconsolable. But he did sort of get over it surprisingly quickly, and became totally committed to to his career, to the exclusion of everybody and anything really. By the start of the World War II, he was Major General. He was sent to France as part of the British Expeditionary Force. During the early part of the war, he spent many days training the 3rd Division on the art of retreat, fighting by day, retreating by night. And he was very strict on physical fitness and expected every officer to run at least once a week. And on one occasion, a rather overweight colonel asked to be excused because he thought he might die. And Monty responded, "Very good thing. I'd rather you died here than on the field of battle and let your men down." Thus, when, as expected, the Germans burst through the Ardennes, he was able to bring the division back to Dunkirk almost unscathed and eventually back to England. He did himself no favours in the immediate aftermath of Dunkirk by telling his superiors that the leadership of the expeditionary force was totally inadequate. He was overlooked for promotion. Churchill called him a little man on the make. He threw himself into training the 3rd Division during this period, and his reputation did begin to grow, but only amongst his subordinates. They saw his ability to motivate soldiers, his understanding of the art of war, his infectious certainty that Britain could win the war even then, and the detail and energy put into training those under his command. They liked his self-confidence, his visibility, and his obvious care to ensure that they had everything they needed. He knew that an effective and successful army was only as good as the people that served in it. So this was the man who in August 1942 was very reluctantly, and sort of only because the person who was preferred was sadly killed, on travelling over on an aeroplane to North Africa. He was very reluctantly appointed by Churchill as commander of the 8th Army at Alamein. So I thought we'd just stop there for a few questions, because that's the sort of lead up, and I'm then going to talk a little bit about Alamein and how he developed his style. So if you've got any things, observations, comments, questions on that part of his life.
Who was that leader?
Gott, General Gott, who'd actually been one of the generals who had led the. I think he was the leader of the British Expeditionary Force. So grandfather didn't think he was the right man for the job in North Africa, but I mean he was appointed. He was actually So he was. I think his aeroplane was shot down on the way to North Africa.
Would it be fair to describe your grandfather as what they would say nowadays as a disruptor?
Well, yes, he obviously was, because I don't think he sort of intended to be a disruptor particularly, because he thought he was being entirely constructive all the time. But I think he clearly had his own view of how things should be done, and they did tend to conflict with a lot of the traditional ways in which, as I understand it, the army had operated in the past. So I think he was a. I mean, it's an interesting question, because he has been described as like that, and certainly the people he served under didn't tend to like him very much. But having said that, if you read stories from his people who worked with him and his staff, they wouldn't have described him like that. They enjoyed his willingness to hear other people's opinions. I mean, he always formed his own opinion, but he did engage in those sort of discussions. But yes, I probably was. Yeah, I don't know. Hello.
Do you think really then he was ahead of his time? He was a leader of more modern practices than they were used to having?
Yes, I mean, because I don't really know enough about the structure of the army, but I do think he certainly had much more empathy with the serving soldiers and understood what it took to get them to do what they had to do in those terrible situations that they were faced. And I think that is something that is much more understood nowadays than it perhaps was then. And I think that point that he made about his observation about World War I generals was sort of highlights that point. Yes.
Is that why he liked the SAS?
Well, I think, yes, probably. I mean, I think he liked the SAS because they, coming back to Martin's point, they were disruptors, weren't they? Particularly at that time. I mean, you've obviously been, I haven't been watching it, but it's obviously, yes, what's it called, Rogue?
Yes, he is portrayed in that, very small.
Yeah.
It sort of comes across as saying, I don't mind what you get up to as long as you win.
Yes.
But was it him or was it Churchill that liked him the most?
Liked the SAS the most. I really wouldn't know. I mean, I certainly think he appreciated what was happening because they were certainly causing a lot of grief to the Germans behind the scenes. So that was, but I don't. I suspect there was an element of him liking it and also being a bit concerned, because what he did like is people to do what they were told. And because he made his plans and he liked to sort of have the control of that master plan. And the thing about how they were operating is that nobody knew what they were doing. So I don't think, I suspect there was a bit of both feelings. Yeah.
You've indicated that he wasn't liked by his superiors or unpopular or looked for promotion. He still made it up to a Major General. How the hell did he do that?
Well, I think because there were certain sort of points on where he sort of shone. And so, for example, I mean, I think even the hierarchy appreciated his sort of ability to train people, and they saw that as important. And so the training manual he wrote, which I think was, as I understand it, I've not read it, but I've been told that it was quite sort of groundbreaking in terms of the approach, was, that obviously made a mark, and so people noticed him. So I think he obviously, A, had leadership qualities, and B, particularly was very good at training men and being clear about what they needed. So I think that's probably why he just gradually progressed. Hello.
Did he have any political opinions with UK? I mean, is that being so, well, not terribly conservative?
No, I wouldn't have said he. I mean, when he was in the, I know when he was in the House of Lords, he sat on the Conservative benches, but I'm not aware when he was young that he gave it much thought. You might well read about he didn't have a lot of necessarily a good view of many politicians, particularly during the war, because he thought they were meddling all the time with his plans. But yeah, I don't think he was overtly political.
Yeah, the guy who played Montgomery in the recent SAS series had a very high-pitched voice. Was that how he actually spoke?
Yes, he did have quite a high-pitched voice, and he also had a lisp as well. And so he has a very clipped voice, but it was quite high-pitched. I mean, I haven't seen the programme, so I don't know what it was like. Yeah. Anyway, we'll move on. So this is we're now in North Africa. So the war hadn't been going well for the British. They'd been briefly successful offensive at the end of 1941 with a breakout from Tobruk when Rommel's army was driven out of Libya. But from January 1942, they were basically on the retreat and moving back all the way through Libya and into Egypt, and eventually by early August they were, early July I think, they were sort of came to Alamein, and they sort of provided a defensive line there at Alamein. But during that time, there had been 80,000 casualties. They'd lost huge amounts of equipment. The army was completely dispirited. Rommel had cult status. Rommel was obviously the general in charge of the German army in North Africa. Plans for further British withdrawals from the Alamein line had been prepared, and Churchill had lost confidence and wanted action. But behind the scenes, things were changing. America was joining the war and was now committed to the war, was planning an invasion in Morocco, and was supplying equipment to the army, and particularly tanks. Germany was being stretched on multiple fronts. Obviously, Rommel's supply lines were being stretched as well. The Navy was being quite successful in terms of bombing destroying the convoys in the Mediterranean, and the Desert Air Force was doing a good job of destroying or interrupting the supply lines once they landed. And that was the position when Monty arrived in Cairo on the 12th of August. But it was a slightly delicate situation because Auchinleck, who was the commander-in-chief at the time, was told that he was in charge until the 15th. Auchinleck and grandfather didn't get on too well because they'd fallen out over grandfather's obsessive training regimes in after Dunkirk, and which Auchinleck I think thought was rather over the top. But so there was a sort of 3-day period when Auchinleck was in charge and grandfather was supposed to sort of twiddle his thumbs in Cairo, but he didn't do that. He actually went to the desert and basically took over command. And so he arrived in the desert at the headquarters of the 8th Army on the 13th of August, and he travelled. He on the way to there, he had travelled with somebody called General de Gangon, who became his chief of staff and stayed with him for the whole of the war. And on arrival, he immediately started making changes. General Ramsden was sort of commander of the 8th Army at Alamein. Auchinleck was back in Cairo. And he was told to go back to his corps, which can't have been easy for him. Monty sent a cable to Auchinleck telling him he'd taken over control in direct contradiction of the orders. He cancelled all plans and orders for withdrawal. He sort of insisted there'd be no withdrawal, no surrender. And he also called a meeting of all the senior staff officers for that evening. And then he went on a tour of the Alamein line to just sort of get a feel for what was happening. And when he returned, there were 60 staff officers waiting for him at his headquarters. And his address to them is really quite well worth reading. It's direct, it's pithy, it's incredibly simple, very short sentences, which was his style, which had an electrifying effect on all those listening. He said his first duty as a commander was to create atmosphere. He didn't like the atmosphere he found. There would be a new atmosphere, one of confidence in the army's ability to defeat Rommel and to hit his army for 6 out of Africa. Those were his words. They would prepare to defend and repel Rommel's anticipated attack. They would get on with planning a major offensive. They'd develop a strong mobile reserve corps that would be trained behind the defensive line. He made it clear that de Gangon would be his chief of staff and that what he said must be taken as an order from Monty. He insisted that orders should be obeyed. He would not tolerate any bellyaching. He was quite fond of that word. If anyone objected to orders, they should remove themselves from command or they would be removed. And lastly, he said that his headquarters should be moved to somewhere more comfortable and, more importantly, close to the Desert Air Force, which would be by the coast. He understood, because he really understood, that the close cooperation of the Army and the Air Force was going to be crucial in the campaign that followed. And then he went to bed. It'd been a long day. But he had on day one implemented critical decisions that would lay the foundation for a successful campaign. The next morning, he was woken by an officer with a situation report. The poor man was given a dressing down and was told that on no account was he to receive situation reports. Those were to be given to his chief of staff. Monty's unique style was to formulate an outline plan and then leave it to his staff to develop it. And for them to worry about the detail. He only wanted to know if the basic plan was not working and things needed changing. That way he felt he could keep his head clear and think strategically. So having developed the overall strategy for the initial defence of the Alamein line, he had 2 tasks. Firstly, that he had the right people in the right positions, and secondly, to motivate the soldiers. And in the former, he was pretty ruthless. He removed people who he thought were not up to the job, all the way down, I think, to sort of colonels, and replacing them with people he had confidence in. This included padres, who he considered to be equally as important as commanders. And then he devoted his time to motivating the soldiers and supervising training. And he instigated a rigorous training program for all the units who had to practice initially defensive manoeuvres for this first battle, for the various attacking options that Rommel might implement. And they had to repeat these training exercises incessantly until they were completed without error. So the first battle went pretty much according to plan. It was called the Battle of Alam Halfa. It started on the 30th of August and was pretty much finished by the end of the first night. There were no offensive moves. The tanks were dug in, the British tanks were dug in, and they basically allowed the Germans to approach them in exactly the place where intelligence had indicated that they would come from, and they were able to destroy huge numbers of Rommel's tanks. And the battle dragged on for a bit. Rommel's tanks were obviously attacked from the air, attacked by 8th Army artillery, and they retreated. It was a victory, albeit a defensive victory, but it stopped Rommel in his tracks and secured the safety of Egypt. But more importantly, it also raised the confidence and morale of the army. They had won. It's the first time they'd won for a long time. Casualties were low, and what they'd been told would happen did happen. The atmosphere had changed. So Monty's second objective after winning that battle was to prevent a significant retreat by Rommel. He wanted them to. He didn't want them to retreat a long way back to a good defensive positions. He did this in 2 ways. So firstly, he avoided too much press coverage because he wanted to give Rommel the impression that the 8th Army was actually weaker than it actually was. And secondly, he allowed Rommel to hold some sort of strategically high ground at the southern end of the line. But he knew that would have two effects. It would keep the line stretched, and it would also encourage Rommel to stay put. And that worked, but it did cause quite a lot of problems and also incurred quite a lot of criticism from some of his commanders. So he then went on to plan for the offensive battle, which ultimately was the Battle of Alamein. And in simple terms, the plan was to have a main thrust or to give the impression that the main thrust was going to be in the south. And to do that, they went on a sort of extensive campaign of building decoys and moving things that weren't really things to look as if there were things there in the south, when actually the main thrust was going to come in the north, which was going to be where Rommel's strongest troops were. And whilst that was going on, he was supervised another training program. But he also established, and this was sort of critical to his style, a team of liaison officers. And those were young men. They were all sort of early 20s, very bright, mostly university trained, who were not career soldiers. And their role was every day was to go out to the front line and find out exactly what was going on and report back to the headquarters. And that was a team of people who he kept with him throughout most of the rest of the war and were with him through the Normandy campaign as well. But politically there was trouble brewing. Churchill needed a decisive victory and he wanted one in September. And that's what he told Alexander, who is now the Commander-in-Chief of the Middle East forces. That's what he told Alexander should happen. Churchill had survived one vote of no confidence in Parliament and he didn't want to face another. And he was also under pressure from the Americans and the Russians to start making a move. But Monty was not to be moved. He needed time to build up an overwhelming strength in personnel and equipment, and he needed to train his army properly for what was going to lie ahead. And so he told Churchill via Alexander that he could guarantee victory in October, but not in September. And Churchill did accept that eventually, but it wasn't quite the end of the problem, because Churchill was then quite rightly concerned that that time would give Rommel time to, or that delay would give Rommel time to reinforce the minefields and would cause problems, which indeed it did later on. But Grandfather was pretty clear that he needed to have the strength and the high morale in the army, the overwhelming number of people and equipment to be able to win that next battle. One of the interesting things is that he predicted ultimately that the battle would last for 12 days, the Battle of Alamein would last for 12 days, and that there would be 13,000 casualties. And those figures are extraordinarily accurate, and interestingly, the same figures, he did the same thing for in the Normandy campaign, extraordinary accuracy. He remained supremely confident about the outcome of the battle. He began visiting all the troops. He explained to them in very simple terms what was expected of them, and filling them with both confidence that they would win and with what he described as fire in their bellies. And there's a story about one of the times that he was going around, when he looked at soldiers sort of on the eves of battles, he wanted them to take their hats off because he wanted to look in their eyes. He wanted to see if they actually had the sort of fighting spirit and the determination to sort of keep going. But what was particularly extraordinary about all of that was the way that he outlined to the soldiers exactly how the battle would work out. And nobody had really done that before, and he did that so that the soldiers would be prepared for what he knew would be a grind. He described how the soldiers and officers would feel at different stages of the battle when things did not go according to plan, that there would be times when they would lose hope. But they were not to worry because he knew his plan would succeed. And partly because of their experience at Alam Halfa, they believed him, and his confidence made a profound impression on them all. And it was during this time that he made a decision to become identifiable, and he initially did that by wearing an Australian bush hat. And he went round collecting badges from all the different regiments, and you might well have seen that hat, or pictures of him with that hat on. And it had a lot of badges on, but the trouble with the hat is it kept on blowing off in the wind. And he was obviously talking to one of his drivers about it, who said, "Oh, well, why don't you wear one of these berets?" And it was a tank regiment beret. And then he sewed on, or somebody sewed on for him, I suspect, his general's badge. So he had this unique sort of badge, beret, that he wore for the rest of the war. That really was why he sort of, I mean, any picture you see of grandfather from that point on, he is always wearing one of those berets. I think he certainly had more than one. There are already, and I think there are 4 of them all in existence at the moment. That was his way of sort of identifying with and making himself identifiable, so that people would know that he was around. So the Battle of Alamein started at 9:40 in the evening on the 23rd of October. The 8th Army at that stage had 195,000 men and over 1,000 tanks. The German and Italian forces 100,000 and 600 tanks, so overwhelming superiority. But as had been proved before in an offensive battle, overwhelming numbers didn't guarantee success, as Rommel had found at Alam Halfa when the revolts were reversed. The battle didn't go to plan at all. There was a complete surprise initially, but it took much longer to get through the minefields. There were lots of changes, reacting to what was happening on the ground. But after 12 days of a very attritional battle, and many setbacks, the Germans and Italians were in full retreat, many surrendered. The battle had been won, and the nation rejoiced. And almost overnight, Monty became a national hero. Partly because the nation probably needed a hero at that time. Was that justified because of his tactical ability? Definitely not. But it was justified because of his unique ability to inspire an army to stick to its tasks despite the setbacks, which they bravely and resolutely did. And considering how dispirited they were just over 2 months before, this was an extraordinary feat. Very few people could have done that, and nobody had done before. So I've outlined some of the characteristics that marked him out. His ability to delegate and not worry about detail. His ability to distill very complex plans into simple instructions that everyone could understand. His ability to judge character and ensure that the right people were in the right jobs. His clarity of purpose. His extraordinary calmness in the midst of chaos. His innate sense of timing and his determination not to act until he was confident of the outcome. Many have some of these characteristics, very few of them have them all. But in my mind, his overwhelming characteristic was his ability to get alongside the men who would be doing the fighting. He knew firsthand what they were going to experience, but they trusted him that he would do everything in his power to limit the loss of life. He had an infectious confidence that he seemed to be able to pass on to his men. That is how the 99-year-old veterans that I talked to today remember him. That is what made the difference, and that is why this extraordinarily difficult attritional battle was won by the British and Commonwealth forces. Churchill, in 1945, described Monty as indomitable in retreat, invincible in advance, insufferable in victory. All true. But the first 2 adjectives were the one that mattered in a battlefield. So that's all I want to say about Monty. But open for questions before I talk about the Spirit of Normandy Trust a bit.
You mentioned earlier on the liaison officers, the young officers,
Yes.
liaison officers, of which I think there were 4 or 5. And I'm interested to know whether the name of John Preston, or Poston, sorry.
Poston, yes.
Poston is mentioned, and what you can say about
Well,
that.
if I'm right, John Poston was the chap who was killed within 2 or 3 days just before the end of the war in North Germany, and you know, grandfather was really upset by that, and he was very fond of. I mean, he relied heavily on. I mean, really heavily on his liaison officers. I think there were more than 5, but I'm not exactly sure of the numbers. There were quite a few of them, but John Poston was one of the early ones, and one of the first ones, I think, who was. I have read the story, but I can't quite remember how John Poston. Have you got a contact and involvement? You're not related to John, are you?
No, not at all. His name, John Poston's name, I was reading about, is on the war memorial in our town, Bradford-on-Avon,
Oh, right,
in
okay.
Wiltshire.
Yeah,
And it was reading about that,
yeah.
and Monty showing unashamedly crying at his funeral.
Yeah.
I think it showed his humanity and the great care and respect he had for those serving for him.
And if you read any of the stories of any of his liaison officers, I mean, they absolutely adored. I mean, as much as the soldiers themselves loved Monty, the liaison officers, I mean, I've only read one book by a chap called Johnny Henderson, who was another of the, and you read that, and you know the affection that they had, and the trust they had for him, and the pleasure they had just in working with him, because it was, he sort of created an atmosphere amongst these young men that made them sort of just want to go the extra mile for him, and I think they really. You know, he had a real bond with them. There's no question. That's why he kept them. And you know, but, I mean, I don't quite know how this worked within the army, but when he was sort of sent back to England to take over the planning of D-Day, he basically brought his whole team with him. So it's question mark, how on earth did the 8th... I mean, I'm not sure how he was able to do that, but he just did. Took them all with him.
And in turn, he, certainly for John Poston, he recommended him to the MC,
Yes.
and also a bar after that.
Yeah,
To the respect.
Yeah. Hello.
Yeah. Do you think your grandfather was over-criticised for Arnhem and underpraised for his role with the Battle of the Bulge?
Sort of my lack of history sort of begins to tell. But funny enough, I was listening on my way down to, what's it called? The podcast that your next speaker has with, which is called, what's it called?
We Have Ways.
We Have Ways, that's what it's called. So I was listening to that, and it was just, I was listening to the one that deals with it talks about the end of the war, and it was sort of, it wasn't very detailed actually, but it was jumping all over the place. But James Holland did say something along the lines of that, well, implying that he was over-criticised for Arnhem because it was so close to being a success, and it was probably. There was a bit where it was unlike Grandfather because it wasn't as well prepared and they didn't have time and it was all a bit of a rush, but it was so close to being a success. But yes, I mean, and the Battle of the Bulge, well, sort of, he sort of came in and he made a big. He actually didn't do himself any favours in that, did he? Because he was rather critical of the Americans, which didn't really help.
Well, he took control, because, and the Americans were so disorganised that Bradley wouldn't even leave his hotel.
Yes.
And it was Montgomery that organised it and broke the initial resistance, which stopped the German breakthrough.
Yeah.
The Americans were still thinking about it.
Yes.
But he doesn't get the praise I think that he deserves in that campaign.
No, well, yeah, I mean, he I mean, the trouble is that, you know, as time goes on, it's easy to you know, different people have different views, and as to, you know, military strategy, which is well beyond my expertise to have any judgment on. But yeah.
Another question.
Was it about the time of the Battle of Alamein that the 8th Army became known as the Desert Brown?
I think so, yeah.
And also, there's pictures, I think, then of Monty with his black beret.
Berry, yeah.
Stood on the top of a tank,
Yeah.
addressing lots of...
Yes, that would be. I mean, I think the beret wasn't an immediate thing. I think the Australian bush hat was. I mean, obviously Australian soldiers there. That's how he got there. He got it, and he that was fairly early on. I think he had that, and through the first defensive battle of Almahalfa. But I think the beret, I think he got really fed up with it because he did keep on blowing off. So that's. But he also, I think because the tanks were, I think he really wanted to give the tank regiment sort of encouragement, because they'd had being in a tank in the desert, I mean, can you imagine it? I mean, it must have been awful. And they also had, you know, they'd had a lot of tank casualties in the previous sort of year, really. And so they were quite, they needed a boost. So I think when his sort of driver, who was had his tank beret on, gave him his own beret and said, "Why don't you wear this, sir?" I think he saw two opportunities there. One was to align himself with the tank regiment that he felt needed a sort of morale boost, and the other, obviously, because he thought that could be quite good. You weren't apparently supposed to wear two badges. It was very bad form in terms of the army. You know, you're supposed to have one badge identifying your regiment, but he put his general's badge on it as well. Sorry, hello. Yes.
You were saying that you thought that partnering were very important.
Yes.
Did he have a continued deep faith?
Yes, he did. I mean, he. If you read any of his, he had a faith throughout his life, and if you read any of his, any of these instructions, you know, on the eve of battle to the soldiers, it was always ended, "May the Lord, mighty in battle, grant us victory." So, you know, it was very. He had a Bible with him, which he carried, you know, throughout the war. And yeah, he had a faith which came from his father, really. I mean, there's sort of there's quite a lot of clergy in the family if you go back, and so the grandfathers, uncles, not my grandfather, Monty's grandfather, and uncles and great grandfathers. I think were all clergy, so they were scattered all over the place. Yeah.
Henry, would you like to move on and tell us about something that we know is very dear to your heart?
Yes.
Henry is the president of the Spirit of Normandy Trust, and all the proceeds from this evening, from the ticket sales this evening, are going to be donated to the Spirit of Normandy Trust, which I'm sure you'll appreciate when you bought your tickets. So, Henry.
Yeah, well, very briefly. So the Spirit of Normandy Trust it took over from the Normandy Veterans Association, the responsibilities when the Normandy Veterans Association disbanded. And they have two main objectives or missions. One is to look after veterans, and primarily that revolves around what we call the annual sort of D-Day pilgrimage. So every year we go over, and I travel with them. So we go over to Normandy over D-Day, over the 6th of June for 5 days, and we visit. We have various sort of formal things that we do. So obviously on the 6th of June, there's, now, thanks to the British Normandy Memorial, we always have a ceremony there. In the past, it was at Bayeux Cathedral or in the cemetery at Bayeux. But we also, there's a statue of grandfather. There's a place called Colville, Montgomery, and we have a little ceremony there every year. And it's always great because the mayor is a lovely man, and he gives us a fantastic sort of, fairly liquid lunch afterwards. Where we drink Calvados. So it's all very nice. But the trust doesn't have any, we're all volunteers, everybody's a volunteer, there's no paid staff on the trust, there are very few core expenses, so all the money is really goes towards the missions of the trust. And as I say, the first one is these pilgrimages, and our aim is to ensure that the veterans and their carers don't have to pay. Last year, the veterans, we had, our youngest was 98, our oldest was 101. Next year, by definition, the youngest will be 99 and the oldest will be 102. So we're going with 8. Well, we've got 8 booked in for this year's trip. They won't, sadly, don't think all of them will be able to travel. At the moment, they're all still with us. But 2 of them, I think, are not going to be able to travel, and we might only be going with 5. But we've still got to raise quite a bit of money to be able to do that. And one of the things that's happened this year is that the government's LIBOR fund, has, in terms of supporting veterans, has dried up. So we're actually having to raise all the money this year, whereas last year we did have some support by the LIBOR funding, which I think was to the tune of about £1,000 per trip. But I mean, the cost of getting a veteran over there and picking up from his home, taking him to, we stay in Portsmouth the night before, and it's about £1,300 a person, so it's 2,600 for each trip. So for each, and sometimes they have to have 2 carers, and they're normally family members, but it's quite a commitment. So I'm really grateful to you for supporting that, and you supported us with something with the proceeds from the revival in June. But we don't just do that. We also support the veterans during the year with whatever their practical needs are. But we also take them on trips during the year, particularly around Remembrance Day. So some of them go to Albert Hall for the annual Remembrance service, and obviously Remembrance Day, the parade at the Cenotaph. We were there with, I think, 9 veterans this year. But that involves getting them up there, putting them up while they're up there, staying in London. And because it's quite an exhausting day, that's two nights in hotels, so it's quite a lot of sort of expense. But the veterans won't be with us forever, obviously, and so as a trust, we're beginning to think about what next. And the second mission of the trust is educational outreach, and it's quite a challenging subject to think what that should look like, and that's what's sort of exercising us at the moment. And why is remembering what happened 80 years ago important, and indeed how should we remember? And surely the main purpose of remembrance, and by extension any educational outreach, is to ensure that those who died to protect our freedoms, the freedoms that we enjoy today, didn't die in vain. World War II was total war. All war is horrific, not just for the soldiers, but for the civilians caught up in the conflict. An estimated, in World War II, somebody died every 5 seconds as a result of the conflict. 60 million people. 75% of those were civilians. I mean, it's just beggars belief. And that those are the people who died, not just the people who were injured, had life-changing injuries, or were traumatized by what they experienced. So, and civilians always suffer in war. Just look at Ukraine, look at Gaza, look at Sudan. According to the Institute for Economics and Peace, in June 2024, there were 56 conflicts around the world. The most since the end of World War II. 92 countries involved in conflicts outside their borders. 110 million refugees as a direct result of conflict. I wonder, in the light of this, I just wonder if we're not perhaps doing remembrance quite as well as we should be. Younger generations are not really that engaged with remembrance anymore. we need to think hard about what remembrance looks like. And those are the sort of things that we're thinking about as an organisation. How are we going to do that? How are we going to make it better? How are we going to tell the story to our children, our grandchildren, about why it's important to remember the sacrifices that were made? So if you've got any thoughts, and we might just have a few moments for any feedback you have on that. If you've got any thoughts about remembrance, how we should do it, be really glad to hear. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. Okay.
Probably a good time to just mention that there will be a retiring collection in aid of the Spirit of Normandy Trust. So if you've got a note in your pocket, then please feel free to leave it at the door. And if you haven't, don't worry about that, because we have a card reader available. So we have all the technology. But just to wrap it up, there's a book that I was given just after this year's Southwark Revival. It's the memoirs of Field Marshal Montgomery. And just to bring things a little bit closer to home, I looked up Broomfield House, where we took Henry and the other Supreme Commander's descendants in June. And there are various references. Monty says, on the 28th of April, my headquarters moved to Southwark House in the Portsmouth area, which was to be our operational headquarters on D-Day. My A-mess was established nearby in Broomfield House. And then you turn over the page, and in his diary, King George came to lunch with me at Broomfield House on the 22nd of May to say goodbye. 2nd of June, here we are the 2nd of June, the weather was deteriorating, I think, probably by then. That night, Eisenhower dined quietly with me at Broomfield House, and after dinner we went up to Southwark House for a conference with the meteorological experts on the weather. We all know how that went. But then, I think the most interesting thing of all that he wrote in his diary on the 6th of June, the date obviously that we all recognise as D-Day, was, I spent the day in the garden at Broomfield House.
He'd done the planning.
He'd done the planning. What a leader. This was D-Day, and he spent the day in the garden. And so, terrific. Thank you for coming this evening, Henry. Now, what else did I have? I had a couple of other unashamed plugs. The Southwark Revival takes place on the 7th and 8th of June this year. Lots of plans. Keep an eye on the website for that. Volunteers, more volunteers, always welcome. So please think about that. If you'd like to get involved in any way, smaller or larger way, then please do be in touch. Contact details are on the website. While you were talking earlier, Henry, you talked about Rommel, and there's a very good book that I'm sure you've read by Peter Caddick-Adams called Monty and Rommel, Parallel Lives. I'd recommend it to anybody.
Got it on the bookshelf.
You've got it on the bookshelf.
I haven't read it.
You haven't read it? I did read it when Peter, who's been here a couple of times and spoken to our Southwark Revival, gave me a copy. And absolutely fascinating, actually, how parallel their lives indeed were.
Yeah. My dad actually became a great friend of Rommel's son.
Did he really?
Yeah.
Wow. Now, if I can get the terminology to work, I want to leave you with just the final thought, and leave the final thought for this evening to Susan Eisenhower, who in the Q&A session at the Southwark Revival this year spoke about Monty and the relationship that Eisenhower, and particularly her mother, had with Monty. So I'm going to have to press play, I guess.
You said something about whether or not your grandfather was adored. I can tell you my grandmother adored your grandfather. You know, they had this little pattern, this little repartee, and Mamie was the best at it. So, do you mind if I tell the
No,
story?
do
Okay,
tell.
about the White House. So actually, Monty came to the White House several times, or a couple of times. He came to the Eisenhower farm a couple of times and actually spent Thanksgiving dinner with the Eisenhowers in 1954. This is President Eisenhower. Get this, at Augusta National Golf Course. That's fun. But anyway, Monty came into the White House apparently and looked around and said, well, it's not Buckingham Palace. And my grandmother, she had these fantastic, large china blue eyes, and she batted her eyelashes and said, well, darling, thank goodness for that. She told me that he, of all of her house guests over the years, was her #1 favorite. And so that's great.
So I thought that was a rather nice way just to round off this evening. Grandfather was obviously a firm favourite of Eisenhower and his wife, although they may have clashed. Ike may have clashed with him during the war years, but afterwards as president certainly was a firm favourite. So thank you all very much for coming this evening. We're looking forward to our next Southern Speaks, which is on the 27th of February. Henry alluded to the fact that we have James Holland coming. I'm afraid it's all sold out. If you just wanted to put your name on a waiting list, then we'd be happy to maintain a waiting list. If we get anybody pull out, then we'd happily contact you and offer you some tickets. So do feel free to email info@southernlions.co.uk just to register your interest in that. Safe journey home, and thank you once again.